Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We're grateful to you for being part of our wider community and for joining us today. Just 2 days after what felt in advance and what certainly seems in retrospect to have been a highly consequential national election. We at the Brennan Center were very involved in working to ensure that this election, to the extent it could be, would be free and fair and secure. And we are working hard to get ready for what comes next. And that is what we want to talk about, those two things today. For those of you who don't know, the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU Law School. We work to strengthen, to reform when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in this country so they work for all. We were started almost 3 decades ago by the family and clerks of the late Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. And we're proud to do what we can to stand up for the Constitution. We greatly enjoy hosting these Brennan Center live events. I'll mention a few things about them. First of all, we believe strongly in civility. If you engage in inappropriate or rude conduct, you may get elected to high office, but you cannot stay on our chat or be part of our chat during this event. We have live closed captioning, and you can follow along with the conversation on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. And so let's get started with today's program. I mean, I probably don't have many things to say at the outset that you all haven't thought about. I might be 3 tweets ahead of you in what I've been reading, but as we're assessing everything that's gone on, it feels like something very big has happened in this country in significant ways. First and foremost, and this is to roughly mirror the structure of the conversation, we have dozens of experts at the Brennan Center, attorneys, social scientists, journalists, and others working to protect our democracy. And we'll hear from a bunch of them today on these different things. First and foremost, we're going to look at the election itself. How did it go? We know that the conspiracy theorists and election deniers were busy in their efforts leading up to the election, but also that the system got strengthened very considerably over 4 years ago. How did it go? I mean, our main takeaway is that the election was, in fact, secure, was, in fact, almost uneventful, with some noteworthy exceptions, dealing with foreign interference and other things that we'll hear about. Then, of course, was the outcome of the election. The American people voted, and they chose as president, for the first time in the country's history, somebody who ran explicitly pledging to be an authoritarian in office, in a campaign that was certainly marked by ugly language, ugly sentiments, but most notably by an insistence that the Constitution was going to be suspended and many other things that sound like, under normal circumstances, like hyperbole. That is what the voters chose. And indeed, we know that it is, in this case, probably, unlike in 2016, the popular vote may go Donald Trump's way, not just the Electoral College. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what it would mean for him or any president to try to govern as an authoritarian. What are the powers that president has? What are the guardrails? What are the ways to make sure that our Constitution holds? This is not only a new administration, probably, or at least very possibly, with a trifecta, with a Democratic and with a Republican Senate and House, but also with the Supreme Court in its immunity decision, an egregious decision, we think, earlier in the summer, stripping away many of the legal protections and constraints on the presidency. What could happen in this next administration, and what can people who care about this, what can people who want to stand up to abuse of power, What can we all do about it? What actual steps can be taken? And we'll share some of the things we at the Brennan Center are working on and things that other people are talking about as well. So there's a lot to cover, both how did it go and what's next. And so to start with looking at the election itself, which was in anticipation, there was so much pressure and so much risk. How did it actually go, and what will we, in the long look and glance of history, think was particularly significant about this election? I'm going to be joined first by two of my colleagues, Gauri Ramachandran, who is a director of elections and security, and who worked with election officials and others on disinformation and foreign interference, and Dan Weiner, who is the director of the Brennan Center's elections and government program, and a focus in particular on the role of big money in politics, which played a new role, a different role in this election. Gary, to start it out with, going back at least to 2016, when Russia hacked emails and was plainly quite involved in the election, the concern about foreign actors has been a significant one. And then on top of that, the risks of that foreign interference being magnified by disinformation, by technology, by AI, and things of that nature. One of the things that did mar the relatively smooth election day was Russian interference. Could you tell us what happened, and should we really be worried about it, or was it kind of a random set of activities?
So you're right. One of the things we did see on election day, although overall the election was extremely smooth as a result of really extensive preparations by local election officials across the country. But one of the things we did see that caused some minimal but real disruptions was a series of fake bomb threats that were called in to some of the major metropolitan areas in swing states in particular across the country. So fake bomb threats that were called into polling places that did cause those polling places in some instances to need to be evacuated, typically for very short periods of time, 30 minutes or less. And then that also caused those counties to need to seek to keep their polling places open a little bit longer because of the obvious inconvenience that voters in those precincts were subject to. So election officials were prepared. They knew that that kind of thing might happen. They actually engaged in what's called tabletop exercises where they practiced for emergencies. They practiced for things like swatting attempts. This bomb threat is somewhat similar, causing a fake emergency event, essentially to disrupt voting. But they did prepare for that. And the FBI announced during the day that they had determined that many of these threats had come from Russian-linked email sources.
We had about AI and the new high-tech ways that we could envision somebody disrupting things. Calling in a bomb threat seems sort of old school in a way. I think of Bart Simpson, calling Moe's Bar or something like that. Why do we think there was more than this, and why do we think this would have been something chosen? And do we think it had an impact on turnout or participation in those often voters of color, heavy, often Democratic strongholds?
In terms of your second question, I don't think we have any evidence that there was a really serious impact on participation, in part because election officials and law enforcement were so prepared. They very, smoothly engaged in these evacuations. They were able to clear these buildings and declare that they were safe very promptly so that voters could come back in. And election officials took the important resiliency step of getting those polling places able to be open a little bit later than normal, so that any voters who had to rush out and then maybe go to work or something like that were able to have plenty of time to come back later. In terms of AI and that sort of thing, we did see some efforts that the FBI announced in the days leading up to the election, some efforts at sort of generating fake or manipulated, manufactured videos that similarly were attacks on our elections and the people who run them. So there was a completely fake video created of election workers in Pennsylvania allegedly ripping up ballots that was circulated. And, our government has indicated they believe that was that was linked to Russia. So we did see some of those other attempts as well. But I think one thing that we've learned in the past few election cycles is that just old-fashioned lying and spreading falsehoods can be can have an impact on people, and so it's important for the American public to be resilient against that.
Well, of course, one of the things that is quite noteworthy is that for all the growing clamor over the big lie and conspiracy theories, there's a lot of data I've seen showing that it somehow magically went away as soon as Trump actually won the election. And it may be too much to hope that this is a moment where we can disabuse people of some of these lies. Dan, the money, this is not the first election in which money has played a significant role. Ever since the Supreme Court set off the basically full deregulation of campaign finance in 2010 in Citizens United, the role of big money in particular has grown and grown. Now, Harris, raised $1 billion in 3 months, heavily through small donors. But I do think, as you've described, looking back at this election, that's less significant than what happened with a handful of very wealthy individuals. Could you tell us what's new and different about that?
Sure. Well, I think you're right, Michael, that in many respects, this was still sort of a watershed election for campaign finance. Not because the election itself was particularly more expensive than prior elections, actually clocked in as roughly comparable. But you had an explosion of money from the very, very largest donors. And not all, but much of that was attributable to President Trump's campaign. He raised about 3 times the amount from donors who gave $5 million or more than he had himself in 2020. Harris actually also raised a little bit more from those sorts of donors. The other thing that's significant, though, is just the nature of how the very largest donors were involved in this campaign. Obviously, there is the example of Elon Musk, who became a key Trump surrogate and basically camped out in Pennsylvania for several weeks. But there's also just the fact that Trump actually, because his own small donor fundraising relative to 2020 somewhat collapsed, actually ended up relying to a significant degree on big money and actually outsourced a lot of his campaign to super PACs and other outside groups that were supporting him. The Trump campaign itself actually had very few employees and very little infrastructure. A lot of that infrastructure was outsourced to super PACs, and that is a new model that we haven't seen before. And Harris ran a more traditional campaign where she had a very robust campaign infrastructure, then super PACs playing an important but secondary role. The question will be, is the model Trump used going to be the wave of the future?
Well, and harder to track as well, because when you're talking about broadcast ads, which were themselves problems and very expensive, they were regulated, and a lot of this new spending is invisible.
That is a big trend here, is that campaign money is becoming harder to track, both because dark money is being funneled through super PACs that disclose their donors, but the donors themselves are opaque, and because so much more money is being spent online.
So Dan and Gary, if you all could please stand by, because we're going to all be taking questions from the several thousand people who are tuned in after we hear from a few of our other colleagues. So don't go anywhere. Yesterday, I had a chance to talk with one of our experts on redistricting, Michael Lee, because gerrymandering, the manipulative drawing of district lines, has a huge impact on elections, and it had a big impact on this one. And it's like the role of money; it can be so ubiquitous as to almost be invisible. So I had a chance to talk with Michael Lee yesterday about what was the impact in this election. We heard about Russians, we heard about Elon Musk and billionaires, but what was the impact of gerrymandering? And here's some of our conversation. Michael Lee, you've been looking in detail at the House districts that will determine control of the House of Representatives. You've said that a few districts will determine that control. What do you see happening? What do you think has happened?
Well, there's very little in play, when you look at the House map, only 22 districts ended up being considered toss-ups. That's near a record low. In fact, there are many more uncontested seats than there are truly competitive seats, and those 22 seats, and maybe you expand it a little bit more to include seats that are leaning one way or the other, but still you get less than 10% of seats that are really in play. And so far that's really held. It's those seats, mostly drawn by courts, commissions, and split control governments, that are going to determine control of the House.
So in other words, it's the states that have had one way or another redistricting reform where you actually have these competitive districts. How important was gerrymandering to these outcomes? You did some analysis before the fact.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that gerrymandering has made Democrats' path to a majority much more complicated. And I should say Republicans, both parties do gerrymander, but Republicans controlled the drawing of far more districts than Democrats did. Republicans controlled the drawing of 184 seats, including big seat-rich states like Texas and Florida. And they use that to their advantage to create potentially an up to 16-seat advantage in the House. So even if Democrats do win the majority of the popular vote in House races, and it's not clear that they will yet, but even if they did, they still might not win a majority of seats, and that's deeply undemocratic. And it really is a handful of states, particularly in the South, but also in the Midwest, that are driving this. We estimated, for example, that in Texas and Florida, both states have about 5 extra Republican seats compared to what a fair map would look like. And, as is oftentimes the case in the South, a lot of that advantage comes at the expense of communities of color, which were both states, the majority of the growth in both states.
That's a pretty significant fact, as you've described in your work previously. So much of the population growth in the United States is in the South and Southwest. So much of that comes from communities of color. How does this kind of gerrymandering not only affect the partisan balance, but the representation gap?
Yeah, I mean, you would think that the South would be very competitive. It's the fastest growing region of the country. It accounted for almost all of the country's population growth last year, for example. And so the South is becoming much more diverse, and particularly in the suburbs, right? And where a lot of people of color are moving. And the suburbs are your classic battlegrounds. People oftentimes talk about America as being, blue or red, but the reality is that the suburbs, where 55% of Americans live, are your classic purple battlegrounds. So you would think the suburbs of Atlanta and Charlotte and Dallas and Houston would be highly competitive, and there's like zero competition in those areas. Despite the fact that those areas are becoming very, very diverse, and in some cases majority minority.
Thank you so much, Michael Lee.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Thank you. I suppose I'm thanking myself. That's very admirable, but not necessary. And thank you, Michael Lee. We have a really thoughtful conversation with our colleague Alicia Bannon about how state courts and state constitutions will play an important role in responding to potential abuses of power in the federal government. We're not going to have time to share that with you now. We're going to make it available otherwise. I will mention that one thing that did happen in this election, as we look back at the actual things that went down on Tuesday, relating to redistricting, which was a surprise, frankly, and a disappointment for those of us at the Brennan Center. There was a very strong measure on the ballot in Ohio to create a nonpartisan redistricting commission, the same kind of commission that has worked so well in other states. The fight was led by the retired Republican Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, by grassroots advocacy groups. We were very involved, and it lost. And it lost due really to kind of chicanery from the state Supreme Court, which rewrote the language that went to voters, so that it literally said, if you support gerrymandering, vote for this. It was an unfortunate defeat, and something we really need to take a look at, because people really care about these democracy issues. I'll mention finally about the election, one of the striking things in the exit polls from Tuesday was that the issue of democracy was the number one issue Now, what does that mean? What did voters mean when they said that? That's actually something pretty important to unpack, not for today, but this was very much on people's minds. One of the reasons it was on people's minds is because people knew, and so many people said, that democracy was on the ballot, that there were risks to the Constitution and to democracy of a kind that we had not seen in a long time, if ever. And that's what we're going to talk about now. We know who won. We know what the governing structure at the national level is going to be, and that poses real new challenges. And so I want to bring in three of my colleagues who are among the experts working on this. Barton Gelman is a senior advisor. He's an esteemed journalist. He led scenario planning exercises for the Brennan Center with dozens of people from around the country, former government officials, to look at just what kinds of things could happen. He is joined by Jasleen Singh, who is an attorney in the Brennan Center's voting rights program, who can talk about the threats in particular that we see to the right to vote from a new and empowered federal government, and Liza Goitein. Liza is senior director of the Liberty and National Security Program and is one of the country's leading experts on the 19th and 18th century laws that have been sitting around in many instances and are part of what we expect President-elect Donald Trump to use during mass deportation and other efforts that we think pose a significant risk to the constitutional order. And again, what can we do about it? So I'm going to start with you, Bart. You've looked in a very broad way at what an untrammeled authoritarian president could do. What should we be looking for in this potential outcome of this administration? And you're on mute. 4 years in, come on.
4 years in. We did a series of 5 tabletop exercises in which we simulated with role players a Trump administration that was determined to carry out the president-elect's most authoritarian ideas and promises. And so we looked at what would happen, for example, if the president attempted to use the executive branch as a weapon against his political opponents, whether that might be Department of Justice investigations and prosecutions or antitrust lawsuits against companies whose owners he didn't like, IRS audits of individuals, or challenges to the tax exemptions of organizations like the Brennan Center that put out ideas that the president doesn't like, regulatory authority, and so on. That was one of our games. We also modeled what would happen if he indeed tried to carry out mass expulsion of immigrants, and we modeled what would happen if he wanted to use military force against the American people, sending troops to crush political protests against him. And what we found was that the president has a lot of authority, and that there's no one weird trick that will stop him from abusing his power. But there are a number of takeaways that show that you can delay or deflect or diminish the damage of abuses. And so we at the Brennan Center, and with the couple of hundred outside experts and former officials who worked with us, will be working to put in place some of those restraints in the coming years.
And who are some of the one of the noteworthy things, especially when you if it is the case that neither the House nor the Senate are in opposition hands, then a lot of the checks and balances that one might hope would constrain power, even when it's been a problem for a long time, obviously, that those don't work as well as hoped. But when it's single party control, which is pretty unusual, it's even less so. But states and cities have power here in what they do. How do you see that playing out?
Well, it's right that governors and state attorneys general, and to some extent, county officials, sheriffs, mayors, all are independent sources of authority that have some capacity to protect their citizens against abuses by the federal government. And so what we found is that going into this, many governors and state attorneys general had not fully explored the boundaries of their authority as against the federal government in urgent situations and in cases of abuse. And so we had two former governors as part of our exercises, and they were uncertain of the exact boundaries of their authority against the presidents when it came to their state national guards. And there are questions that come up when federal law enforcement officials come into a state and want to take certain actions, whether the state has any control over those. State courts certainly have the power to hear cases, as well as federal courts. And we believe that although litigation can't be counted on as the primary restraint on authoritarian behavior, that courts still matter, lawsuits still matter. And that's the case even though Trump has had a significant role in reshaping the judiciary. And certainly the Supreme Court is much more partisan than it used to be. But in his first term, Trump was restrained multiple times by courts who said he could not do the things he wanted to do, or couldn't do them in the way he wanted to do them, or in some cases had to do things he didn't want to do. And we expect that the judiciary will still be a restraint against Trump in his second term.
Although, of course, as in recent years, the Supreme Court that did the immunity case is not tonally anyway the same place it was a few years ago, and future justices Cannon and Kaczmarek may be even more deferential than current justices. Liza Goitein, at the Republican convention, they handed out signs saying mass deportation now. Mass deportation of millions of immigrants is a central priority, maybe the central promise of this new administration. To do that, they would need to use extraordinary executive power to achieve that goal. What do you see happening on this prospect of mass deportation, and what are those tools? And could you tell us a little bit about what you found out about how they could be abused?
Sure. So yes, Trump has made it very clear that mass deportation is pretty much the first item on his agenda. And I expect that on day one, we will see an executive order, likely declaring a national emergency, hijacking funds for the border wall, which is something that he did in his first administration through emergency powers, and ordering the relevant agencies to identify and begin the process of deportation for anyone unlawfully in this country. Now, how that plays out is sort of the $1 million question. The actual scope of this effort, and nobody thinks it's feasible to actually deport 11 million people or 12 million people over the next 4 years. But even if that number is reduced by an order of magnitude, the administration would quickly run into logistical problems. For example, the time that it takes to hold hearings for all of these individuals, and that to which they are entitled under immigration law, and the sort of backup that would produce, and then even just the logistics of detaining them pending deportation and actually deporting them. The kinds of numbers that they're talking about go beyond what the Department of Homeland Security has at its disposal. And this is where you start to see where emergency powers might start to come in. When it comes to the issue of holding hearings, for example, for these immigrants, there is an antiquated law, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. It is the last remaining vestige of the notorious Alien and Sedition Acts. it can be invoked during a declared war, or if there is an invasion or a predatory incursion or a threat of such invasion or incursion by a foreign nation or government. And in those circumstances, the president can summarily detain and or deport people in this country who are not U.S. citizens, who are natives of the enemy nation. So natives means they don't have to be a citizen of that country. They just have to have been born in that country. That would be sufficient. And they can be lawfully in this country. They can have a green card. They can have lived here for 20 years. They can have children who are American citizens. And under this law, they can be summarily detained and or deported, meaning without the process that would otherwise be afforded to them under immigration law. This was last used, this law, to implement the mass internment of non-US citizens of Japanese, Italian, and German descent during World War II. And the way that Trump would presumably implement it here is by asserting that the drug cartels are the de facto governments, because there has to be a foreign government perpetrating the invasion. So that drug cartels are operating as the de facto governments of certain regions of Mexico and other countries south of the border, and that those governments are perpetrating an invasion. Now, those may seem like ludicrous factual claims, but the Supreme Court, in various analogous contexts, has said that these questions of whether there's an invasion, whether a foreign government is actually a foreign government, that these are questions that only the president is allowed to weigh in on, that essentially the courts cannot second guess those judgments. The other law that I think is relevant here, and this gets to some of the logistics of deportation, is the Insurrection Act of 1807, which is the law that allows the president to deploy federal armed forces, including federalized National Guard troops, to quell civil unrest or to enforce the law. This law is the primary exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, which is the law that generally forbids federal armed forces from engaging in civilian law enforcement unless there is an express statutory exception, and that's what the Insurrection Act is. Now, this Posse Comitatus principle is really core to our democracy and to the preservation of individual liberties, because an army turned inward can very quickly become an instrument of tyranny. So you might think that any exceptions to that law would be drawn very carefully and very narrowly. Unfortunately, the Insurrection Act is the opposite. It gives the president almost unlimited discretion to use federal armed forces as a domestic police force. The criteria for deployment are set forth in archaic and vague terms that really provide few clear constraints. And even if there were clear constraints, the Supreme Court, again, has held that the statute gives the president unreviewable discretion to determine whether those criteria are satisfied. In fact, in early versions of this law, there were requirements for an ex ante for judges to sign off on deployment ahead of time, and also for those deployments to end after a certain period if Congress didn't essentially affirm them. Those safeguards were stripped out over time. So the court, at this point, Congress and the courts really have no meaningful role in checking this power. So the Insurrection Act could be used to bolster the DHS capacity to conduct these arrests and detentions and deportations.
So the bottom line is very powerful laws, rarely antiquated laws, rarely used, with few guardrails, but which to be used as part of this potentially very brutal mass deportation of immigrants brings the federal government potentially into conflict with the state governments and others who are utilized in this. And we don't usually use Latin on Brennan Center Live, but between ex ante and Posse Comitatus, we're going to make a necessary exception. Jesseline, as you know, of course, and as those who follow the Brennan Center know, the fight for fair elections and voting rights is at the heart of what we do. There are great potential risks on that score from, in particular, a weaponized Justice Department. If you read Project 2025, Steve Bannon, now out of jail, says, "Oh, guess what? We are going to do Project 2025." After the day after the election, he announced that, and it focuses quite a bit on voting rights and on using the criminal law to go after election officials and all other kinds of things. So we know there are things that a Justice Department that is treated as not as an independent source of law and legal protection, but as a kind of personalized strike force. We know that is an area where, as we look toward the 2026 election, there's considerable risks. There are also considerable risks in Congress. And I think people don't quite realize what a Trump trifecta could mean on voting and voting laws.
I'm happy to, speak on that. So, I mean, I think there's a lot that the federal government could do if they do get to a trifecta. Even if we just focus on Congress, we already have some indication of what that may look like. For example, Republicans introduced 2 bills in Congress in the last couple of years that show us where they're headed. One was the ACE Act, which contained a myriad of restrictive voting-related provisions. That bill included a nationwide ban on third-party ballot assistance. It would have required a copy of an ID to ask for a mail ballot. It also removed certain safeguards on campaign financing. So we may see a version of that resurface. And just this year, we also saw the SAVE Act get introduced. And that SAVE Act would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. And this is something that all of us probably heard swirling around in the lead up to the election. It's possible that this was part of, just broader messaging, a broader conspiracy theory about citizenship and voting rather than an actual policy Republicans want to implement. And Brennan Center research has shown that millions of Americans could be disenfranchised if they needed to show proof of citizenship to vote. Republicans, Democrats, young, old, but regardless, I think it's certainly something that we should keep our eyes out for. It's likely to come up again. And, even in Congress, one thing to keep in mind with any new legislation is the filibuster. To get anything passed in Congress, you do need to get through the filibuster in the Senate. And so there's at least one check in place for any legislation that would restrict voting access from passing, at least for now. And, the trifecta, so we have that's Congress. As far as the executive, I think one of the things to look out for is Trump can appoint federal judges. And when it comes to voting rights, we have already seen Trump appointees from his first term having already done a lot of damage to the Voting Rights Act, for example. So at least one decision finding that there's no private right of action to bring a claim for a private plaintiff under the Voting Rights Act. So that's something that could happen under the executive. And then looking at the DOJ, we most certainly can expect the DOJ to change position in all of its statewide litigation. So, for example, in 2017, there was a Texas photo ID case that was still moving along when Trump was elected. And the new administration basically joined Texas's side in that case. And right now, we know there's litigation around Georgia SB 202, Texas SB 1, which Brennan Center is involved in, Texas redistricting. And so we can certainly expect the new DOJ to change their positions in those cases. And then in terms of sort of more affirmative action within the DOJ during Trump's first term, we know that the Department of Justice the voting section brought a single case under the Voting Rights Act. So we can expect the Voting Rights Act to not be enforced in the same way under this administration. And the focus is likely going to be much more on list maintenance. That's pretty standard for a Republican administration. And given the frenzy of activity on that front prior to the election, that is probably an area that they might focus. So just a view at the sort of 3 branches of government when it comes to voting rights.
And it's important to note. So first of all, you're right. We don't know who will control the House. That will be up in the air for at least a few more days because of so many races on the West Coast, in California in particular, where voting is all vote by mail and it just takes longer to count. And so, of course, if the House is controlled by the opposition party, that opens up all kinds of differences in terms of what legislation is brought up to the floor for a vote, who has the subpoena power and the power of oversight. But it is noteworthy that there are national voting restriction laws. Language, people who a couple of months ago said, oh, no, there should never be national legislation. This is all just something for the states to do. Now we're saying, oh, national standards make some sense. And some of these are quite broad. When we talk about documentary proof of citizenship, that sounds kind of, what's wrong with that? A little bit anodyne. That means you have to show a passport or a certified birth certificate or naturalization papers to register and thus to vote. And so many millions of people, American citizens, don't have those things. And the other legislation is kind of a broad, restrictive voting bill. We call it HR -1 to give a sense of its sweep and scope. So that is something that we may be talking about in coming months, depending on what the alignment is and what the legislative priorities. There are some legislative reforms. Why don't we bring in all the other folks who were on this call? But Liza, some of these areas actually are places where there can be legislative action and where there has been sometimes unexpected bipartisan support and cooperation. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's very much the case. In general, there is broad and deep support on both sides of the aisle for reforming emergency powers. And that's more generally, I consider Insurrection Act and Alien Enemies Act to be types of emergency powers. There are others. There are powers available under the National Emergencies Act, which we didn't get a chance to talk about. But in general, there is deep support for that and broad support. And that might seem surprising, but it probably shouldn't be, because emergency powers can be, and they have been, abused by presidents of both parties. If you think about some of the worst abuses of emergency powers in our nation's history, anybody's top 5 list would have to include the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, the mass internment of 100,000 Japanese Americans, and the CIA's torture of detainees after 9/11. These were implemented by a Democratic president and a Republican president, respectively. And more recently, Democrats were outraged when President Trump declared a national emergency in order to secure funding for the border wall. Republicans were equally outraged when President Biden relied on emergency powers to forgive student loan debt. The truth is that no president, regardless of party, should have access to these incredibly potent powers without meaningful safeguards against abuse. And there has been bipartisan support for reform. Republicans actually led the primary effort at reforming the National Emergencies Act during Trump's presidency, his first term. And Democrats continued to support it. They supported it then and continued to after Biden took office. So will this consensus survive the election? And will the general support for emergency powers reform extend to specific powers that Trump has been promising to use? I mean, that we'll find out soon enough. That's really the question.
So we have quite a few questions coming in from folks who are joining us on Zoom. And one of them is a fairly specific question, but it's one of the immediate things on people's minds. As you know, Donald Trump has been convicted on 34 felony counts, but is also facing 3 other prosecutions, 2 federal, 1 in state court in Georgia. What impact will his re-entry into the Oval Office have on those cases? I can answer that one, or one of my colleagues. Well, Jack Smith, the special counsel, has already made clear that he will be stepping down. One question many people had, and he brought both the incredibly vital, in my view, prosecution of Donald Trump for illegally trying to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power last time. And that was the subject of the Supreme Court's ruling granting wide immunity, but not complete immunity for that conduct. He's also, his office as well, brought the prosecution for classified documents and obstruction of justice in Florida. one thing I've seen suggested is that why would Jack Smith step down as opposed to making Trump fire him? Because Trump said he would do so in the first 2 seconds of his presidency. Jack Smith can do something he has not yet done, which is issue a public report on the documents case, for example. He made a lot of his evidence available in the other case in court. But his role, in a way, in going forward, is to preserve the record. What about the prosecution in New York? The former president is due to be sentenced for his 34 felony convictions next month, I believe, or maybe later this month. There's a longstanding principle, which is that you can't prosecute a sitting president. You certainly couldn't incarcerate a sitting president. I would imagine that case, which is not subject to a presidential pardon, would be held over for 4 years, rendering it somewhat in deep freeze. But this decision by the voters puts a stop to these other prosecutions in a meaningful way. What can Congress do, or the Biden administration do, between now and January 20th to fortify, if at all, against some of the potential abuses we see? Dan, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, the president can issue executive orders on some of these topics, including putting some restraints on the use of the military domestically, et cetera. That can be undone, but for the time being, it can put in place new rules and new processes that take a little while to undo. So there's a lot of sort of throwing sand into the gears that is legitimately part of the strategy for dealing with some of these actions that we can anticipate seeing. And Congress absolutely can. I mean, Congress has a couple of bills that they really need to pass in the lame duck, or at least they should. I mean, I think they will pass a National Defense Authorization Act. Whether or not they'll pass a continuing resolution of appropriations is a little more up in the air. There's legislation that needs to be passed. Everybody and their mother will be trying to get their pet, issue onto that NDAA, but absolutely, the administration, or hopefully, will be prioritizing measures that will maybe to some degree help to insulate against some of what we are afraid of seeing.
One other thing that I would just add is it'll be really significant how both the administration and Congress handle the presidential transition itself, because this is the first transition that we'll be going through after the Electoral Count Act has been overhauled. And I think if you saw in Vice President Harris's concession speech, and I think you'll see in how she plays her own role in the transition, an effort to set a precedent for how we do a peaceful transition of power. One thing that people do find very troubling is that the vice president-elect, J.D. Vance, has said that if he had been vice president in 2020, he would not have conducted the joint session the way Mike Pence did, that he would have potentially tried to obstruct the transition. I think it's very important for the vice president to make clear that that is not legal, and to conduct herself in a way that kind of sets a precedent for how future presidential transitions will unfold. And I think you'll see that broadly in Congress as well.
Thank you. I have a question for all of our colleagues. Many states have more expansive protections for abortion rights, for voting, for many other things, and policies as well. How much ability do states have to protect their own residents, and what role can states play in a moment like this? I'll call on someone.
I would say states do have the power to enshrine rights legislatively or in their constitutions, and in general, they have the power to enforce and make potent those rights. The federal government, Congress, can override state legislation, although not state constitutions, but it has to do so explicitly. And so there will be room for state legislatures and state Supreme Court justices to empower their citizens in ways that the federal government does not.
And as we'll share the video with our colleague Alicia Bannon, there's a really robust and exciting movement to use state courts, state constitutions, direct democracy through ballot measures and other things, not just to follow the federal government in lockstep, but to actually have even stronger protections very frequently. I want to quickly turn to Project 2025 and then ask about what lessons we can learn from what we saw this week. Project 2025, was became a brand name for bad stuff, but it's a real document of considerable heft and real plans. Other than the things we've already described, what are the things in Project 2025, even though they may run away from it, but they're planning to do the actual items that are in it, whatever cover is on the book, that people should know about, that relate to the civil service, that relate to the politicization of agencies and things of that nature. Dan or others?
I can take it quickly and then maybe pass it to Gowrie. The thing that I think, one thing that people should be very aware of is the weaponization of the Department of Justice. And Project 2025 has some very chilling language about undermining DOJ independence, which has been a norm across presidents of both parties since the Nixon era, when you saw how it went the last time. I think that for our election officials around the country, I think there is some particularly upsetting, chilling language in that document about prosecutions of election officials turning civil rights laws on their head and prosecuting election officials over disagreements over election law. And I think that connects to the way that Project 2025 promises to politicize the civil service through what's called Schedule F, which would transform and convert a lot of civil service appointees or employees into political appointees, which of course allow them to be fired. So we'll see how much of it they do. Obviously, the president has distanced himself from it. I know, Gowrie, you've looked at other aspects of that if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think one of the things that's in Project 2025 that's quite concerning when it comes to elections and election security is there's a real plan to kind of take the federal government out of really assisting our state and local election officials with all the amazing preparation and security that they got ready for this election. And earlier when we were speaking, I talked about how they were so prepared, and that is part of what really prevented those attempts at interference by Russian-linked accounts from succeeding and impacting the election really heavily. But it's really agencies like CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, that have been really assisting state and local governments with that preparation. So gutting that sort of mission would be really dangerous for the future safety and security of our elections. There's also a real attempt to get the FBI in the document out of helping the public be aware of, and helping social media companies be aware of foreign agent-linked, bots and other accounts that may be spreading disinformation on their websites. And we saw just a few days ago that it was really important that the FBI was able to get out there on election day and make a public statement noting that these bomb threats were hoaxes, so people don't have to be afraid, right? And they don't have to be deterred from voting, and that they were coming from these foreign government-linked accounts, which means, there's nobody here that can plant the bomb, so don't worry, you can go vote. It is really important for the federal government to make those public statements and help educate the public that voting is safe and secure.
And one of the questions that we have, it goes to that very issue of what did we learn that can from this past week that can help us keep our elections strong going forward. One is the role of law enforcement, the positive role that we at the Brennan Center have bit to do with through the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, the work with sheriffs and others. Of course, here in this administration, the federal law enforcement was not in the election denial conspiracy theory business, but was actually working hard to try to protect the vote. And one of the goals, of course, going forward is to, as much as possible, have that level of professionalism. Justine, are there any other things that we should take away from how this election did and didn't work? Because, of course, there were still enormous numbers of discriminatory laws on the books that affected hundreds of thousands of voters. What do we need to know from what just happened for our work going forward? And then I'm going to ask you all one very brief final closing question.
I mean, I think I'm thinking about what Gowrie started out with. Voters still showed up. This was, democracy worked as it sort of should have this election. Brennan Center, I know a lot of us here were tracking what was going on the day of, and a lot of routine things happened, but by and large, people voted, and this is the outcome, and we are supporting that. And honestly, I'm proud of the work that we have done. I'm proud of the work that the way that we have equipped election officials and made sure that everyone had the resources that they needed to ensure that they would have a secure election day. And I think that worked.
And for the vast majority of voters, overwhelmingly, it was uneventful. And
Correct.
The dog that didn't bark, and that didn't just happen. That was because of all the work by voting rights groups, by law enforcement, by election officials, especially, and others. I want to ask each of you, what is the one thing you hope the folks listening today take away from this conversation? And I'll start with you, Bart.
I think my biggest advice, my biggest takeaway right now would be to hang in there. I've talked to people who are talking about moving overseas or quitting their jobs or leaving the civil service or exiting from public life because they're dispirited by the outcome. And my message is stay and fight. My message is that this is just as much our country as it is anyone else's, that Trump does not actually have a mandate to be an autocrat. I don't believe that careful exit polling and subsequent survey work is going to find that most of his voters actually want him to weaponize the government against his political enemies. And even if they did, in a democracy, you can't have a majority vote for something undemocratic and call it democracy. So my advice is stay and fight. Do what you've always done to protect democracy and the rule of law in this country.
Dan Wiener. You're on mute, though.
Sorry. 4.5 years, still making that mistake. I thought Bart put that very well. I'll just add, democracy is not just about having an election every 2 years. Democracy is a system. It's in the preservation of civil rights and civil liberties. It is also about making sure that everyone has a meaningful voice and can't be drowned out by vast accumulations of private wealth. And so the goal over the next 2 and then 4 years and beyond, right, is to have comprehensively a democracy that works for everyone. And as I think others have said, that's something we've worked on for many years, and it's something we're going to be proud to continue working on in the years ahead.
Justine.
Echoing what Bart said, it's okay to take a beat. It's okay to take this time to feel disheartened about where we may be headed, but know that organizations like the Brennan Center and partner organizations doing grassroots work are doing our level best to ensure that we have institutions and civil rights protections that are still standing on the other side of the next 4 years.
Liza.
Yeah, I feel like I'm echoing what others said, but I think we need to be clear-eyed about the task ahead. The fight ahead is going to be difficult. It's going to be a big fight and a hard one. It is not a hopeless one by any means. The Brennan Center and other organizations have been preparing for this very, very diligently for many months. We've longer than months, actually. we have sounded the alarm about some of the powers I was talking about precisely because they are so lacking in meaningful checks. But in the course of doing this research, we've identified legal weaknesses in these laws that can be challenged. And in the course of the tabletop exercises that Bart was in charge of, we identified potential interventions by relevant actors in the system that can help, that can throw sand into the gears, as I said, and at least slow down some of the actions that we're worried about. There are we have a mission, we have a plan, we have the expertise and the knowledge and the tools that we need to act on that plan. And so I want to make sure that everybody leaves with a sense of seriousness, but also a sense of hope.
Gary.
I think one thing I'd say is that even if we see the kind of claims of rigged elections and, deceased people voting and those kinds of things sort of slip away because of the result of this election, I think it's important for people to remember that there are still foreign governments that are really interested in and are still actively trying to interfere in our elections. So people should be thankful to the election officials who gave them this wonderful, safe, and secure election, and make sure that they're provided with the resources moving forward to continue to do so.
I will echo what my colleague said. This is an unnerving moment. The country is divided, but the government is not as divided and has the potential for tremendous abuse of power. That is the challenge. One thing that gives hope is there is a democracy movement, broad and deep and wide and diverse across party lines, of people who've made very clear they care a lot about preserving the system of self-government that we have built and that which we revere. That democracy movement will be tested as it has not been in a long time in coming months, and we will be a big part of that. At the Brennan Center, we are looking ahead. We're looking to see what kinds of affirmative changes can make people's lives better, but we are also ready for this moment. One of my colleagues said we were made for this moment, and we will do our very part going forward to make sure that the Constitution stands strong. I want to thank my colleagues who are among the dozens of folks working day and night at the Brennan Center on behalf of these goals and these ideals. Thank you to the audience for the questions. We look forward to seeing you at the future events, and I will note that if you want to hear from many of us or many outside thinkers and activists and scholars, we have other events. We have an events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center. Thank you for being here, and the fight goes on.